So I'm going to be criticizing a very common atheist argument here, and the argument that I'm going to be dealing with is basically the problem of evil. That is, if God exists, and if God were all good, how can he allow suffering? And it's a very common atheist argument. How could he allow suffering? I mean, he's supposed to be the one with the highest morals and also an infinite being. He's the one who should know better. You'd be thinking all of that, right? The answer to this is somewhat complicated. Sophisticated, if you want to shine a positive light on it, is because without lots of suffering, you can never feel just how great it can be to live normally. When you look at a miserable poor person and realize that poor people make a larger part of the population, you feel lucky, though still, religion demands your generosity for this very reason. Be grateful to those who took the position of suffering, because if they are suffering against their will, that is, God forced them to play a game of life in which they were miserable, that would be evil on God's behalf, and I doubt that an evil God would allow me to live such a pleasant life. Also, after recovering from a sickness, you feel like gold for a while, right? Being miserable for a certain amount of time is really just a learning experience, and to help you appreciate having a normal life, and also not to just take your life for granted. Not to mention that if there is a heaven, an afterlife, then life here on earth is merely a stage in which we're supposed to have fun and or learn something. If you were God, you might get bored of being invincible. It's very boring to create a game in which saying, "I win," is the way you win. Nobody plays an instant "I win" button game. You would want a challenge, right? There are restrictions in which God places by limiting us through the laws of science and nature. Kind of like how we restrict ourselves to play the game of chess. In chess, if you were to just yell, "I win," and not play by the rules, but we play by the rules because we learned through that game, you also might feel lonely as God. You would want to create a game for yourself, right? I mean, here's a paradox. How could God be truly unlimited without being able to experience being limited? So apparently, the game of life is how the paradox reconciles itself. Also, you can still quit the game of life, even though in religion it states that suicide is a sin. And why is suicide a sin? Because God made it against the rules for you to leave the game. He wants you to experience feelings through the game of life, things that you learn, and he knows that you can go back to whatever the world of souls look like by committing suicide. Suicide means you're basically quitting the game of life. The only time God might find suicide acceptable is because maybe you might be really suffering and you realize that there is no way to escape it. In that case, suicide might be just a less painful way of dying, which I'm sure God, which is supposed to be all good and all-knowing, a master of morals, will find that acceptable. Plus, if a good person can suffer in life but go to heaven, and if a bad person goes to hell even if he had a beautiful life, the first option would be better. Why? Because in a theistic world, temporary suffering and reaching heaven would certainly be a whole lot better than the evil man who had a nice life, and then has to face negative consequences later, which will somehow have to make up for whatever hell may be like. Kindness and the good people always win in the end. So even if you're suffering with something similar to the Holocaust, you can always look forward to heaven and seeing the people who did it to you in hell. I'm not trying to pull a Pascal's wager, but I don't think you're going to comfort any poor person in the midst of suffering by telling them that God doesn't exist. So I'm not saying that because this is a nicer world set up than one with no God, therefore God has to exist, but I'm saying that based on the information I'm giving you through this video, an atheist is actually the one with the slightly worse belief, because after death, if God were not to exist, then therefore there is something after death that is not known, but at least known to be a lesser consequence, poorer than any of the religions say will happen to you after death. I notice that something atheists say about this is that it's wishful thinking, but that's not really a thought-out counter to what I've said, because it's basically implying that the negative worldview is more likely without any evidence. Also, this is philosophy I'm dealing with, not science. I'm explaining that if God were to exist, then this is the system that goes with it. The reason why this counter doesn't contain science is because the argument I'm dealing with contains no science either. Just reasoning, and I respect that. I mean, I just did an entire video on this. Also, one last thing, in no way am I suggesting that God exists because this argument is wrong. I may have proven why this argument is wrong, but it doesn't prove that my belief in God is correct. Google Russell's teapot and you'll see why. That's it for today, atheist, agnostic, theistic, and deistic viewers alike. Atheists, you have discovered one less argument that works. Agnostics, you have another reason to consider why religion may be neater than you think, even though it's not evidence. Theists, you have one less thing to worry about. Deists, you have one more reason to consider why religion doesn't sound as strange as you think it is, even though it doesn't in any way, shape, or form provide proof or even a little evidence of God. Thank you.